Okay, let me just talk a little bit about Evangelism Strategies International, or ESI for short. Here's the banner on our website. To engage in evangelism is to engage in frontline spiritual warfare, hence the pieces of armour, Ephesians 6:12. To win the war, we must think, plan, pray, and act strategically, biblically, and intelligently, hence the chess pieces, Matthew 10:16. This ministry merges, therefore, these two great biblical themes. So what's the biblical definition of evangelism? Let's get that straight right at the very start. To evangelize is to spread or proclaim the gospel. So what's the gospel? The gospel has three aspects: words, works, and effects. So right at the beginning, we're going to really want to find out what the gospel truth is and get it right. What is evangelism and what's the gospel? For example, if I pray for a person who has cancer, my prayer is a work of the gospel. There's the person being prayed for. If they were healed, their healing would be an effect of the gospel. But here's the key question. But have they heard the words of the gospel? The answer is obviously no. So the words are critically important. To evangelize, therefore, is to spread or proclaim the words of the gospel. And we mustn't get confused between these three different aspects of the gospel. So what words are we to proclaim? Well, according to the scholars, any genuine gospel message must cover the following essential areas of content: why we must be saved, how Jesus can save us, what we must do to be saved, and the cost of being a disciple. If that content is not covered, we have not proclaimed the Christian gospel. By spreading the gospel, for example, just one example, I mean doing something as simple as giving away a small business card to someone, which would direct them to a website where they could hear the gospel. And there's a card and there's a website where somebody could hear the gospel. In other words, spreading the gospel is when the gospel is communicated via somebody else and not yourself. By evangelism, I don't mean standing on a street corner with a megaphone looking weird. There's nothing wrong with street preaching, but not when it's weird. Proclaiming the gospel is when a person explains the gospel to another person personally. So let's get back to our website banner, having discussed that issue. What about the byline, making disciples, growing the church? Well, most Christians have never been discipled in evangelism, believe it or not, which is why research shows the church in the West is in decline. What's the main cause of this decline? Well, I put it down to Bible colleges and seminaries. Did you know that research shows that only 10% of seminaries and Bible colleges around the world now have a course on evangelism? That is absolutely incredible, given it's the mission of the church to evangelize the world. That means that every single person on the earth hears and understands the gospel at least once. And believe it or not, of the seminaries that do teach evangelism, it is only like a sideline course. It's not a core subject, compulsory for everybody. Hard to believe, but it's true. This is how far we have slipped. And what happens is people graduate from Bible colleges and seminaries, and they have no heart for evangelism and no heart for the mission of the church, which was to evangelize the world. And so they pass on that attitude and that non-desire for evangelism to everybody in their church. And hence the virtual collapse of the Great Commission in the West. That's the truth. Well, here's a little bit more that we need to know from church history about evangelism. Further research shows that 100% of the early church were mobilized for evangelism. Of course, there were some obvious exceptions. That's a generalization. And it experienced explosive growth. And basically, the book of Acts is about the growth of the early church. We learn from this that there is a direct correlation between evangelism and church growth. Today, only 2% of Christians evangelize in the West. If your church or denomination has stopped growing, it's because the people in your church have stopped evangelizing. Now, most churches in the West have in their mission statement the importance of evangelism and reaching people with the gospel. many heads of denominations, many strategic people inside church denominations preach and promote the need to evangelize. But you know what? They don't do it. They just don't do it. It's become a theory. You see, what we can learn from history is that evangelism precedes genuine church growth. So there's a right and wrong focus here. Most churches in the West ask, how do we get more people to come to our church? I believe it's the wrong focus. In contrast, the early church asked, how do we evangelize the world? This is the biblical focus. It's the right focus. It's the focus of Jesus. So what's the lesson from history? If we focus on Jesus and his command to evangelize the world and making disciples who have a passion for the same, the church will experience explosive growth again. If we don't, it won't. So I've said enough is enough. If we continue to focus on getting people to come to our church and not on evangelism, the overall numbers of Christians in the West will continue to decline. You see, the decline can in part be attributed to churches turning away from evangelism in order to grow, to a reliance on marketing in order to grow. Now, marketing is just doing up your shop front to attract people from other churches, existing Christians, to come to your church. Now, there's nothing wrong with marketing, but not at the expense of evangelism. Some churches in the West have grown phenomenally through marketing without doing any evangelism. As a ministry, we want to address this issue. Marketing precedes transfer growth. Evangelism precedes genuine growth. See the difference? Non-involvement in evangelism precedes negative overall church growth. The decline of church numbers in the West can also in part be attributed to churches turning away from evangelism towards social action in order to grow. We completely endorse social action, don't get me wrong, and the need for it, but not at the expense of evangelism. People think the best way to win the world is to serve them through social action. As a ministry, we want to address this issue as well. Dislocating social action from evangelism opens the door to further church decline. How does it do this? Well, we can unwittingly give potential converts the impression that a Christian is just someone who does good works. If the church only does good works and is perceived by the non-Christian world as just doing good works, this is what follows. As such, they reason, well, I do good works, so I must already be a Christian. Why go to church? Existing Christians can get the same idea and drop out of going to church, which often leads to leaving the faith completely. So the challenge for us as the church is to keep the biblical balance. If we're all social action, showing the love of Christ through practical deeds, and no evangelism, i.e. spreading or proclaiming the gospel, we are acting unbiblically. But if we are all evangelism and no social action, we are also acting equally unbiblically. It's not social action or evangelism, it's both. Another factor contributing to a decline of the church in the West is our preoccupation with evangelistic events. Now, don't get me wrong, special events have a definite place in God's plan to redeem his world, but they are not his A plan. You know what? I wish we had a Greg Laurie and a Reinhard Bonnke and a Billy Graham crusade in our town every single night. It would be amazing. But you know what? These crusades are not God's A plan. And in this video, I'm going to explain what his A plan really is. God's A plan is to mobilize the church, those without the gift of evangelism, for the day in, day out, 365 days of the year, proclamation or spread of the gospel with friends, family, and total strangers. Wow. Why the need to go to total strangers? Well, there are at least 4 reasons, and here they are. You've heard the research that supposedly shows most people come to faith through a friend or a family member, right? Well, this research is terribly flawed and very misleading. Here's why. If only 2% of Christians engage in personal evangelism, and the most common way Christians connect with non-Christians is through friendships and by bringing them to church, and you conducted a survey to find out how people came to Christ, it would not be surprising if the results showed most people come to Christ through a friend or a family member, because that's the only way it's happening. If there's only one horse in a race, we should not be surprised when that horse is announced as the winner. Come on. Don't be fooled. If Jesus commanded, go into the world and preach the gospel, and you're being told, don't preach the gospel, just make friends with people and build relationships, who are we to believe? Well, you know the answer. So I want you to think it through all this. Why the need to go to total strangers? Well, I've said there's at least 4 reasons, and here's the second reason. The Christian church represents a tiny proportion of the total population. In most countries, it's about 5%. If we limit our evangelism to friends and family, we will soon run out of friends and family. So who's going to reach the rest? The bulk of the population. People without a Christian friend or family member. Furthermore, research shows that most Christians don't have any non-Christian friends. Typically, this is what happens. Those who do have non-Christian friends lose them as they get older. We only have so many friends and family, folks. So let's get with it. 3, there are many people we all brush with each day who don't have a Christian friend or a family member. This is, for example, people at petrol stations, shops, schools, public transport. Should all these people be denied Christ because they don't have a Christian friend or family member? Well, that doesn't sound like the love of God to me. Well, you know the answer. 4, the Great Commission given by Jesus was to reach the whole world. Well, it really was for the whole world, the whole church to reach the whole world with the whole gospel. So to restrict our evangelism to friends and family is a blatant compromise on the command of Jesus. On the folly of relying on event evangelism, Mark Middleberg, the evangelism director for Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, he writes this: "The biggest mistake I see churches making in the area of evangelism training is to view it as a one-shot deal or even as an annual event. When that happens, everyone loses." Well, I know in our nation we've really conditioned ourselves to love events. I'm not going to name them, but you know what I'm talking about. For these reasons, Jesus always intended evangelism to be organic to his church rather than a special event. How do we know this? Well, in Mark 16:15, he said, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel." The construction of the Greek translates "as you go," meaning that proclaiming the gospel is meant to happen as we go about the ordinary course of each day. Where else does the Bible indicate evangelism was always intended to be a 365-day of the year experience for every believer? Well, Ephesians 4:11-14 teaches that evangelists are gifts given to equip believers for the work of ministry. Well, what ministry is that? Well, it must be to teach, and it can only be to teach people in the church how to evangelize. If all those outside of Christ need ministry, that is to hear the gospel, and they do, and most Christians brush with non-Christians somewhere each day, why wouldn't we daily express the love of God by meeting their need? I don't know any biblical reason not to meet their need, not to present the gospel to them. Until evangelism is organic in every church and organically part of the life of every believer in the way I've just described, it will be impossible to complete Jesus' Great Commission. In fact, it will become mission impossible. And by the way, the Great Commission has 4 parts, just to brush up on this. Go, proclaim or spread the gospel, that's to evangelize, baptize those who are saved, and disciple those who are baptized. See, if there's no proclaiming or spreading going on, there's going to be no one to baptize, and then there's no one to disciple, and so we have a decline situation. In fact, by relying on events, we might even be unwittingly inoculating the average Christian against personally engaging in evangelism. How so? They will reason, I don't need to personally do evangelism. The expert at the front of the church or the event will do it. They've always done it. So I'll just leave it to them. We nearly always see people saved when they do it. Why change a winning formula? See how this works? By relying on events, we are unwittingly conditioning Christians to think that evangelism only happens at certain times of the year or on special occasions. We unwittingly train them out of and away from 365 days of the year evangelism, which is God's A plan. They come to reason we only do evangelism on special occasions. As such, we are undermining the as you go about your day New Testament ideal. Only do evangelism on special occasions, only reach friends and family, don't go to strangers, don't proclaim or spread the gospel, but only make friends with people, win the world through social action and good words, etc. What is all this? Well, I call it stinking thinking. It is not the mind of Christ, and it's something that we should never have in our church. Well, just to clarify, the Great Commission will be completed when every person on the earth has heard and understood the gospel message clearly at least once. It will be mission completed. By the way, there is a direct relationship between mobilizing the whole church and ushering in the second coming. Matthew 24:14 says this gospel must first be preached in all the world, and then the end shall come. What's the end? It's the second coming. That mission will not be completed. In other words, Jesus will not return until that condition is met. So, I see this as being the greatest challenge to our Christian church today. In my opinion, the greatest challenge facing the modern church is the challenge of mobilizing all believers to be faithful with day-to-day, 365 days of the year as you go about your day evangelism. Evangelists with the gifts, here's a bit of a note for you. This is your mandate from God. Spend your time mobilizing others for evangelism. This is your job description from heaven. Obviously, you've got to be doing evangelism yourself, otherwise you have no authority to teach anybody else. You see, it was the famous evangelist D.L. Moody who said this: I don't want to do the work of 100 men. I want to get 100 men working. That is God's perspective on those with the gift of evangelism. Evangelists, the current tragedy. Many evangelists have compromised on their calling and gifting. Rather than training Christians how to evangelize, they've reverted to training people how to establish friendships with the unchurched, or how to be a person of influence, or how to tell one story. Now, all those things are important. They're all good. But they're not the core, they're not the main aspect of the job description of an Ephesians 4:11-14 evangelist. That's the problem. All the while, millions in the world are perishing, having never heard the gospel once. Others have dropped out of, that's evangelists, have dropped out of equipping the saints for the work of ministry altogether, and instead have gone into real estate sales or politics or insurance sales or pastoring. This is a tragedy beyond words. Well, the goal of our ministry is this. God has given us a vision. It is to connect with, work with, and serve church leaders who have a passion to see 100% of their people actually and personally spreading or proclaiming the gospel at least once a week. That is to be active in evangelism. We are shooting for this goal for at least 5 reasons. Firstly, biblical precedent. Generally speaking, the entire early church was mobilized for evangelism, and it grew exponentially. So we want to follow their example. 2, obedience. The Great Commission was given to all the disciples. Since we are all his disciples, the responsibility to evangelize the world belongs to all of us as well, personally. 3, sound theology. The gospel message is a seed, the power of God for salvation. If we sow liberally, we'll reap abundantly. If we sow sparingly, we'll reap sparingly. That's not a verse just for money. Relates to everything in life. 4, logic. The more lines a fisherman has in the water, the more likely he is to catch fish, and the more fish he'll likely catch. The more people in your church who engage in evangelism, the more people there will be winning people to Christ. 5. Learning the lessons from history. Evangelization precedes church growth. As we understand it, the mission of the church is for the whole church to take the whole world, the whole gospel to the whole world. Many churches are not growing. The reason they are not walking in the truth of one or more of these reasons. So we don't feel to compromise at all on our goal of trying to mobilize everybody in every church. Who says this is a biblical goal? Well, first of all is John Stott, well known and a tremendous man of God. He says that the evangelization of the world is the priority of the church. He puts it like this: the church's mission of sacrificial service includes both evangelism and social action, so that normally the church does not have to choose between the two. But if the choice has to be made, if you had to rank social action and evangelism like a race in the Olympics, gold and silver, then this is what he says. Then our first duty is to communicate the words of the gospel. There you go. If evangelizing the world is the priority of the church, and the church is made up of the people inside the church, and it is, then to engage in evangelism theologically and biblically is the priority of every individual in the church. Does that not make sense? It does. Who else believes this? Well, we all know Derek Prince. Derek says that he's another mighty man of God, had a massive ministry while he was alive. He says that the priority of the evangelization of the world is the priority of the church and the priority of every believer. Listen to what he says. The supreme purpose of every true Christian church, the chief duty of every Christian minister, the main responsibility of every Christian layman, now that's everybody, is to present to all who may be reached, in the clearest and most forceful way, the basic facts of the gospel of Christ, and to urge all who hear to make the definite personal response to these facts which God requires. To this, the supreme task, see what he calls it? Every other duty and activity of the church must be secondary and subsidiary. Wow, what an incredibly succinct and well put together paragraph. That means that the evangelization of the world must be secondary, must be primary, and other things in the church that we make such a big deal of become secondary. Well, I don't know any church in the West, anywhere, which is living in the truth of what Derek has just said there. Bill Hybels put it like this: evangelism training is for every believer. We need 100% participation. Every Christian in the world, regardless of their spiritual gifts or he or she may have or not have, is part of the church to which Jesus gave the Great Commission. We as leaders need to make sure that believers understand this, and then we must do everything in our power to equip them for it. This is the only way we're going to build highly contagious churches. Well done, Bill. What a magnificent man of God you are too, bro. So, if you are over being the pastor of a maintenance mode church or a busy but not evangelistic church, and you're tired of just transfer growth, of just getting growth from marketing, and of just discipling people who've been in Christians for years, and you're frustrated that you are not seeing genuine conversions coming from the skill and the hand of everybody in your church, regularly in your church, then we'd like to connect with you. So what's it take to mobilize 100% of the people in a church to evangelize at least once a week and sustain them in it? That's the hard part, keeping everything going. Well, I've said it's a lot like painting a house. Here's a house which needs painting. It's a lovely old home, but it's in a state of disrepair. This is what a church looks like in the spirit when only 2% of its members are active in evangelism. No matter how beautiful and wonderful and incredible a church looks, if it's not evangelizing, that's what it looks like in the spirit. It's not pleasing to God, let me tell you. Here is a home or a house whose paint job is immaculate. This is what a church looks like in the spirit when 100% of its members are active in evangelism. Well, this house painter is considering two strategies for painting the old house. Here are the two strategies. Strategy 1, thoroughly prepare the house for painting. In other words, and then paint the house and then do annual touch-ups. We'd call that a wise and responsible painting strategy. Strategy 2, paint the house as is. Do no preparation. In other words, just slap the paint on over what you see there in the picture. Just slap it on. Hurriedly move on to paint the next house. Now, what do we call that? That's a foolish and irresponsible strategy. So here's two strategies for mobilizing a church. There's the church. Strategy 1, thoroughly prepare the church for evangelism. Show the people how to evangelize. Maintain the mobilization through careful planning. We call that a wise and responsible strategy. Well, here's strategy 2. Mobilize the church as is. Do no preparation. Just do some rah-rah to motivate and equip the flock. Just whip them up and move on to the next program or project in the life of the church. Now, we know what we call that. Why is one strategy wise and responsible and not the other? Good question. Well, the wise and responsible painter recognizes there are three distinct phases to painting a house. Prepare the house for a repaint, apply top coats, perform regular maintenance. To prepare a house for a repaint, he knows he has to water blast, scrape the old paint off, fill some cracks, sand, do some priming, put some undercoat on, and so on. Then he has to apply top coats, and then he carries out maintenance, regular touch-ups on the paint job. A wise painter recognizes that all the hard work is done at phase 1, preparing the house for painting. Likewise, the wise and responsible pastor recognizes there are three distinct phases to mobilizing a church for evangelism. Prepare the church for evangelism, that is to eliminate mindsets and influences which inhibit evangelism. 2, teach your people how to evangelize. 3, maintain evangelism momentum. Phase 1, set your people free. Eliminate wrong mindsets and other influences which are causing the people in your church not to share the gospel. You see, there's a right and a wrong way to do this. Painting a house properly involves much more than slapping paint over the top of the old paint. Mobilizing a church for evangelism and seeing it grow through new conversions involves much more than simply inviting an evangelist in to teach your people how to do evangelism. Just training people for evangelism without dealing with root causes will only waste time, money, and valuable resources. In fact, we will inoculate people against evangelism. Phase 3, applying top coats. What's that? Well, for pastors, this is providing your people with the skills and tools to be able to actually do evangelism. Teaching your people how to lead people to Christ and how to disciple them. Phase 3 is maintenance. That is regularly doing touch-ups, touching up the paint job. For pastors, this is implementing specific strategies to maintain long-term evangelistic momentum. That's the key bit. The final result, a magnificent house. The final result for a church, a thriving, genuine growth, biblical, Great Commission focused, Book of Acts, Holy Spirit infused, full of new life, where everyone has the skills and motivation to win people to Christ. Church, wow, what a church that would be. That's God's desire, that's God's will. So, what strategies must you as a pastor implement in order to prepare your people for evangelism? Well, the first strategy is this. We recommend you attend or host a church Change the DNA of Your Church conference for the leaders of your church. Put that on just to start with for the leaders of your church. To find out how to host a conference and what's involved, please visit our online library. Go to that website, click on Resources, then on Seminar Attendees, and use the password Mark1615. Look for the section Attend or Host a DNA Change Conference. The second strategy is read Julian Batchelor's book on evangelism. By reading this book, you'll become aware of root causes, mindsets, and other influences which are causing your people to not do evangelism. To access free chapters of this book, please visit our online library again. Start downloading the chapters of this book and please read them in order. As a result of executing strategies 1 and 2, that is attending the conference for your leaders and reading the book, you'll discover what we call the 12 lost truths. Well, what are these 12 lost truths? Well, at various points over the last 2,000 years, these 12 critical truths have been lost. You say, how do you lose a truth from the Bible? Well, truth do get lost. Look at salvation by grace through faith. For 1,000 years in the Middle Ages, 500 to 1500 AD, basically the Dark Ages, that truth of salvation by grace through faith was lost, and it was only Martin Luther who ripped the covers off it in 1517, but it had been lost. Truths can get lost, and we found that there are 12 critical truths which have caused the collapse of evangelism in the West. The loss of these truths has caused the people in your church to shut down in evangelism. The recovery of these truths will set your people free to evangelize. So our ministry is basically a truth recovery ministry. After you as the leaders of your church have become familiar with the 12 lost truths, what then? Well, preach the 12 lost truths to the people in your church. To cover all 12 truths will take up 8 Sunday mornings. This will prepare the people in your church for evangelism and help eliminate the root causes of influences which stop them doing evangelism. We provide the PowerPoint slides for each message and the notes for each person in your church. So we made it really easy. What then? Well, strategy 4, preach 10 back to the basics messages. These messages will eliminate the mindsets which cause the people in your church to not engage in evangelism. These messages will cover topics such as what is a Christian? Just what is a Christian? Why do we live by what's written in the Bible? How do we know it's God's word? How do we know how it was recorded out of the mouth of Jesus? Was it written down, or was it just oral, passed on orally? How do we know what was written down was written accurately? What was the time lag between when it was spoken and when it was written in the form that we now have it? How do we know that there was no changes made? How do we know that it hasn't changed over the last 2,000 years? People want to know this, and they're not going to have confidence in this Bible if they don't get this information. What happened at the fall in Genesis 3? Why is the whole world fallen? And what does it mean, fallen? What happened in Genesis 3? Why do we need to preach the gospel? Why did Jesus die on the cross? Why did he need to? What happened at the cross to reverse or potentially reverse the curses that were dished out in Genesis 3? Are all people outside of Christ really lost or not? Are Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and sincere people who sincerely believe they are right, are they really lost? What about babies who die? What about the intellectually handicapped? What about them? Those people who can't make decisions intellectually, who can't understand. Are they lost? Heaven and hell, what are they like? And who's going there? Boy, we need to know this stuff. What does it mean to make Jesus Lord? That's a huge sermon. Who is the Holy Spirit? Why was he given? And why do we need him? The Christian worldview, what is it? How is a Christian supposed to be radically different from anybody else in the world? How are we supposed to be countercultural? What does that mean? Why preach these 10 messages? Well, as leaders, we presume our people know the basics. The sad truth is the vast majority don't know. They just don't. Without a thorough understanding of the basics, there will be no mobilization for evangelism. That's the truth. Well, as the sermon series in your church is progressing, that is, you're teaching the 10 back to basics messages and the 12 lost truth messages, and after completing all the sermons, you'll be implementing other strategies, which include giving your people skills and tools on how to actually do evangelism well, how to lead people to Christ, and how to disciple them. In total, there are 28 strategies. To get more information on all the 28 strategies, including what they cost to implement, please just visit the online library. If you're the pastor of your church, you won't be implementing these strategies on your own. You've got a lot to do already. So you'll choose someone in your church to become what we call an evangelism team leader, or ETL for short. They work alongside you to help you implement the 28 strategies. Coaching. We coach your ETL one-to-one in person or by email, phone, or Skype. Having your ETL coached is another one of the 28 strategies. Evangelism Team Leaders Guide. Your ETL and your coach will be working with a document called an Evangelism Team Leaders Guide, or ETL Guide. This document unpacks the 28 strategies. Step by step, it explains how to reach the goal. Download this from the online library. Most churches have an existing year plan, that's true. As the pastor, and before you start your sermon series, we urge you to sit down with your ETL and the other leaders to see how many of the 28 strategies you can integrate into your existing plan. It's critical that you and your leadership have unanimous buy-in before you start on this journey, so that if you encounter rough water, and you will, as was the experience of the Christians in the early church, you'll be able to stand strong and united as a leadership team. Why have this meeting? Well, in Luke 14:28, Jesus said, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" Implementing the 28 strategies will turn your church from being a love boat into a rescue craft. Now, we know that love boat exists for the pleasure of the people on board. It exists for their comfort and for their entertainment. It's totally about self. But a rescue craft is totally about the person outside the boat. It's about bringing people who are in danger into a place of safety. That is what these 28 strategies are about. These 28 strategies are not a new fad or something we've heard on Joyce Meyer or Charles Stanley. They are simply strategies which are guiding churches back to the original mandate of Jesus. You're going back to what was always God's A plan for his church. These 28 strategies are like divine tugboats, leading your church back out into the open water of the world with the gospel to seek and save the lost. I love that photo. How will this change the existing ministries in your church? Well, think of the various ministries in your church as being like the various parts of the human body. There's the body. Well, let's call the home groups the head, and the neck is the Bible studies that you do during the week. CAP, that's Christians Against Poverty, could be the shoulder. Social action, worship, youth, children, families, Alpha, Christmas box, seniors, the office team, overseas missions, school makeover, prayer, mainly music, and so on and so on. Why is evangelism not mentioned so far as a ministry of the church? Well, that's interesting. It's the blood. It will run through every ministry in your church. It feeds everything, giving it focus. It's the ultimate reason every ministry exists, because it's the most potent way to glorify Jesus. It's the mission of the church. These strategies provide a pastor with a clear pathway for leading his or her church back into success with the Great Commission. Basically, back to creating a church with a culture of evangelism, and ultimately genuine church growth. Finally, ever wondered why New Zealand or any other country in the West is winning the gold medal on just about every negative social indicator? We've got legalized gay marriage, record teenage suicide, rampant alcohol abuse, overcrowded prisons, record family violence, and so on. Well, John Stott said there's a reason for all this. We have seen that society needs salt, preservation, and light reformation, but only the gospel can create them. Gospel proclamation creates an antiseptic effect in which blasphemy, selfishness, greed, dishonesty, immorality, cruelty, and injustice find it harder to flourish. A country which has been permeated by the gospel is not the soil in which these poisonous weeds can take root, let alone luxuriate. Boy, only John Stott could write like that. Wasn't he great? God bless you, John Stott. What's he saying? He's saying this: society is slowly rotting in front of our eyes because we've stopped evangelizing. Our salt has stopped flowing and our light has gone out. If we want thy kingdom come, why are we not embracing God's way of bringing it? There are three keys to success with mobilizing your whole church, and here they are. The more of the 28 strategies you implement, the sooner you'll reach the goal. Some pastors have just looked at the 28 strategies like a smorgasbord and taken one and two they like. It won't work if you do that. 2. Unanimous leadership buy-in is essential before you start. 3. Implementing these 28 strategies is going to change your church significantly. Embrace the change passionately, confident you are moving back into the very epicenter of Jesus' will, purpose, and mission. Well, God bless you for watching this video. Here's our contact details. There's an email, there's a phone number, there's a mobile number, and there's 3 websites which are associated with this ministry. God bless you. Thank you so much for watching, and may God glorify himself through this video as you mobilize your whole church for evangelism. God bless you.